Good afternoon. Hi, can anybody hear me? Great, great. I'm Jack Klieger. I'm President and Chief Executive Officer of the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I'd like to welcome you to this great book talk. Stuart Eizenstat is Chair of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. He is a Phi Beta Kappa cum laude graduate of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which created the Ambassador Stuart E. Eizenstat Chair of Modern Jewish History, and is also a graduate of Harvard Law School. He is also, by the way, a high school basketball star who was an honorable mention All-America from Atlanta, and as I understand, a great passer and playmaker, which prepared him very well for his career. During his public service in 4 administrations, Ambassador Eizenstat served as Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor to President Carter, held a number of key roles in the Clinton administration, including Ambassador to the European Union, Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, Undersecretary of State for Economic, Business, and Agricultural Affairs, and Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. To me, as importantly, he has made Holocaust justice and memory a major part of his career, which we thank you for in great gratitude. During the Carter administration, Ambassador Eizenstat recommended a President's Commission on the Holocaust chaired by Elie Wiesel, helped draft the legislation authorizing the creation of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. In the Clinton administration, he served as Special Representative of the President and Secretary of State on Holocaust-era issues, and during the Obama administration, as Special Advisor to Secretaries of State Clinton and Kerry on Holocaust-era issues, negotiating major recoveries from foreign corporations and governments on behalf of survivors and families of victims. As Special Negotiator for the Material Claims Conference, since 2009, he has negotiated additional compensation and social services for survivors, including, on a personal note, my mother and father, with an increased emphasis on Holocaust memory and lessons. He is currently Special Advisor to Secretary of State Anthony Blinken on Holocaust issues. He chairs the board of the Defiant Requiem Foundation, honoring the memory of the musicians and artists at the Eizenstat concentration camp. Also on that board is one of our board members, Vice Chair Patty Kenner, who has had a key hand in setting up this day's event, so thank you for that as well, Patty. Ambassador Eizenstat has received 8 honorary doctorates and more than 75 awards, including the USHMM's highest honor, the Elie Wiesel Award, as well as honors from the governments of France, Legion of Honor, and in fact I just heard he's getting a second one, Germany, Austria, Belgium, Israel, and the United States. Stuart Eizenstat has authored many books, including Imperfect Justice, Looted Assets, Slave Labor, and the Unfinished Business of World War II. Today he will be discussing his new book published this year, The Art of Diplomacy, How American Negotiators Reached Historic Agreements That Changed the World. Following the talk, there will be a book signing on the first floor. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Stuart E. Eizenstat.
Jack, thank you very much. This is a museum that has a special meaning for me. I've been here several times, but most recently, just about 6 weeks ago, we had our most recent round of negotiations with the German government for Holocaust survivors in this building. And I'm absolutely convinced that the tour that we took the German delegation on through the museum set the right stage for what ended up being a $2 billion agreement for fiscal 25 and 26 for home care, for special supplemental payments for pensions, and importantly for Holocaust education. So again, Jack, thank you for arranging that and for your introduction. I want to also recognize Josh Mack and Sidney Yeager, who have been instrumental in putting this program together, and for Patty Kenner. Patty really was the one who made the shidduch for this event, and she is involved in everything good. in this city and more broadly in the Jewish world and in the political world. Mona Golombek, our dear mutual friend, is also here. And I think Carolyn Maloney, our former member of Congress, has just come in as well. And just a couple of other personal notes. My law school classmate, Dave Kay, and his wife, Susan, thank you for coming. And my relatives, Alice Gold and Debbie Rennert, are here as well. At a turbulent time when the world is beset with conflicts that seem incapable of peaceful resolution, my goal in writing this book were first to show that U.S. diplomacy backed by expert negotiators could actually help solve today's problems as they did those in the past 50 years. In addition, I wanted to take a hard look at the role of military force in diplomacy in light of the many wars in which our country has been involved during our lifetimes with very mixed results, to learn the lessons about whether, when, and how military force should be used, which is especially relevant with today's hot wars in Gaza and Ukraine. And last, I wanted to show how critical it is for the U.S. to be engaged in the world in making this a better place, and to underscore the perils of what I am very concerned about we're seeing in this country now, and that is looming isolationism. If we go back to the kind of isolationism we had between the First and Second World Wars, we will create an even more perilous and dangerous world in which our adversaries, particularly the Chinese and Russians, who have very different values and interests, will fill that vacuum to our great disadvantage and to the disadvantage of our children and grandchildren. I based the book on 130 personal interviews of American and foreign leaders and try to put you, the reader, in the negotiating room with them in the 12 major agreements I looked at and in the use of military force as well. I call this the art of diplomacy because there is an art to diplomacy. It's like an artist creating a painting, framing negotiations so the other side is convinced that it's in their interest to accept an agreement which is in America's interest. The bottom line for each side is not what you want, but what do you need. They are not a poker game, a winner-take-all. Indeed, they have to be a win-win situation because you're dealing with sovereign countries. Nor are they like commercial negotiations, which are one-off agreements usually about how you divide a pot of money and which are enforceable in law. There is no outside authority to enforce international agreements. It depends on the trust of the parties. The diplomatic successes that I describe in my book start with the President selecting the right person to be the negotiator at the right time. And while that doesn't guarantee success if the parties themselves are not invested in the process, and more on that later when we talk about Gaza, there's no question but that we would not have had the opening to China without Henry Kissinger, German reunification in NATO without Jim Baker, the Good Friday Agreement on Northern Ireland with George Mitchell, the Camp David Accords without Jimmy Carter, the Dayton Accords ending the war in Bosnia without Richard Holbrooke. Now, I want to disabuse you of the notion that there is a sort of man or woman on horseback who can save the day if the parties themselves have such fundamentally different interests that they can't reach an accord. And again, we'll come to that when we deal with Gaza. Normally, negotiations can be successful with the right negotiator when the parties recognize the status quo is unbearable. The best example of that is what happened in Northern Ireland. In typical British understatement, they called the 20-year civil war between Catholics and Protestants the Troubles. Well, the Troubles ended up killing 3,500 people and maiming tens of thousands of others. And finally, the pain was so mutually harmful that the parties said, enough is enough, we have to find a diplomatic solution. The other basis for negotiations in addition to having, again, the right person, is when the benefits are so great that the prospect of compromise becomes possible, like Sadat deciding to go to Jerusalem, or the Crown Prince of the UAE making peace with Israel under the Abraham Accords. All of these are instances in which the benefits that could accrue with Sadat trying to get the Sinai back, for example, are such that a good negotiator takes advantage of these and goes forward. There are a common set of skills that the best negotiators have. The first is a really fierce determination to seize the historical moment to succeed, to overcome all obstacles in the way of success. Jimmy Carter did this at Camp David with 13 days and nights of negotiations. More on that a little later. Secretary of State John Kerry did it in reaching an agreement with the Chinese on climate change, having this tremendous desire to do it. But the best example is really President George H.W. Bush. The Berlin Wall fell, and he seized the opportunity to realize the two Germanys needed to be reunited, and they needed to be reunited in NATO. Again, more on that later. Successful negotiators often have something that may surprise you, and that is courage. Not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage to break from established modes, to break from your own political base, to take positions that may be unpopular at home. This was in vivid display again when Protestant and Catholic political leaders broke from their constituents and decided it was time to put aside violence. It happened so many times in the negotiations I mentioned, but what hasn't happened in the current dispute that we've had for so long between Israel and the Palestinians is we haven't had the Palestinian leaders who have been willing to challenge their own bases. And I wish I could say to these kids who are demonstrating on college campuses, because I've been at many of these, at Camp David in 1978, we could not get any Palestinian to come. They wouldn't accept UN Resolution 242, which was land for peace, and it was a condition. They wouldn't agree in 2000 when Prime Minister Barack and President Clinton offered Arafat 95% of the West Bank and East Jerusalem as a capital, and 50,000 Palestinians coming back for reunion. They wouldn't do it again in 2009 with Prime Minister Olmert offering 96% of the West Bank and East Jerusalem as a capital. And in the year 2005, to bring it current, a very hardline Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, decided that Israel needed to get out of Gaza. He pulled out every single Israeli soldier and forcibly removed, and I wish we could show these videos to these kids, of the Israeli soldiers forcibly removing 7,000 Israeli settlers from Gaza and handed over Gaza to the Palestinians with all the infrastructure intact. Greenhouses, light industry. Hamas won the election a year later, took over in 2007, and destroyed it all, literally destroyed it all. A third attribute of a good negotiator is the intelligence combined with wisdom and judgment, and to always be prepared, and be prepared. It's like a good student at school. And the best example of that is Jimmy Carter at Camp David. He studied studiously the CIA reports on Sadat and Prime Minister Begin. The 13th day occurred. It looked like Camp David would collapse. They were close but not there, and Prime Minister Begin came to President Carter's cabin and said, "Mr. President, I cannot and will not make any more compromises. Please get me a limousine to take me to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane ready to leave. I'm going home." And Carter, realizing that this would undercut Sadat's historic trip to Jerusalem, and that if he came home empty-handed, he would be at great risk, and that it would affect his own presidency, remembered from studying these CIA profiles that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren. And he made 8 copies of the original photo that was taken when the 3 of them came on day 1. We're now on day 13. And he autographed each one personally to Begin's grandchildren, walked over to his cabin and handed him the 8 photos, and heard Begin vocalize the names of each, to each one with best wishes for peace, Jimmy Carter, and saw tears come into his eyes, his lips quiver, and he said, "Mr. President, I'll make one last try." And that's when Camp David was done. So knowing your subject, knowing more than anyone else at the table, knowing where the areas of compromise are, is absolutely critical. One of the most unappreciated talents for a negotiator is the ability to listen. Not to just come in with your position and continue to repeat it, but listen to what the other side is saying and how they're saying it, and with what inflection of tone, what's their body language, what do they need to get out of it. That is absolutely critical. So you put yourself in the shoes of your opponent. You develop what former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, my boss when I was his deputy, called unsympathetic empathy for the other side. This is really critical in order to be successful. Next is the ability to develop trust. Successful negotiators see their counterparts not as adversaries to be humbled or defeated, but as potential partners to achieve a result which both can live with. Building trust requires developing a personal relationship. An example, after the fall of the wall, George W. Bush was urged to go to Berlin and, in effect, dance on the fallen wall. Democracy has won. Communism has failed. And he said, no, I'm not going to do it because that will humiliate Gorbachev. I need him to negotiate German unity within NATO. And then in another personal touch, his Secretary of State, Jim Baker, and Kissinger did the foreword for this book and Jim Baker the preface. Jim Baker took the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Shevardnadze, to his ranch in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and spent 3 days, yes, negotiating, but establishing a personal relationship, talking about his children, his grandchildren, what their hopes were for the future. And that really broke the ice and allowed Shevardnadze to break from the established positions of his own foreign ministry. Now, these personal relationships are oftentimes not enough. A great example is that President Roosevelt believed that he had such a personal relationship with Stalin that he could make Yalta a success without reckoning for Stalin's ultimate objective to take over much of Eastern Europe when the Nazis were defeated. But still, developing that personal relationship is really critical. Another critical factor is the use of something called back channels or track 2 negotiations. These occur when the 2 parties are so antagonistic, like, for example, Hamas and Israel, that they will not come into the same room together, and you need intermediaries. The first prisoner release was done by having, in effect, back channels with Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, parties that would not have to have the same constraints. Examples also include the Oslo Accords of 1993, which established mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO, done by Yossi Beilin, off the record, not even known to the Prime Minister until it was made public. The negotiations of the Iran nuclear deal in 2015 began when John Kerry used the Sultan of Oman, Qabbas, as a trusted intermediary, given the deep mutual distrust between the U.S. and Iran. Creativity is also important, and again, this is why I call it the art of negotiations. To overcome seemingly insoluble problems, which always arise during these negotiations. Ambassador Chet Crocker demonstrated this during the Reagan administration, when he showed great creativity in handling negotiations over the wars in Southwest Africa. He developed the principle of linkage, under which South Africa would withdraw its troops from Namibia in exchange for Cuba withdrawing its troops from Angola. And when George Mitchell faced a seemingly impossible impasse in the Good Friday agreements, because each of the militias, the Catholic and the Protestant, the Unionist and the Nationalist militias, so distrusted each other that they wouldn't give up their arms, and no one wanted to negotiate while that was going on. So realizing that at the outset he was facing what seemed to be an insurmountable problem, he developed creatively something called the Mitchell Principles, in which they could keep their arms, but they had to sign in writing that they were committed to a nonviolent solution of the conflict. The ability to compromise by using oftentimes ambiguous language is often a key to success. So, for example, after the '67 Six-Day War, UN Resolution 242 established the concept, which exists to this day, of land for peace. But it was written with ambiguous language about Israel withdrawing from territories occupied during the war without defining which territories. That's still a conflict today, but it's very important. And the Shanghai communique that Henry Kissinger negotiated with Zhou Enlao also was ambiguous in terms of the status of Taiwan. It basically said that that should be determined by peaceful means, that there was one China without defining which was the one China. And that communique is still the basis for relations today. One other factor, which again may be a surprise, is pure stamina. Negotiations take years, at least months. Sometimes they always seem to end at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's like running a marathon with a sprint at the end. Carolyn knows this from her congressional negotiations. And you have to be able to think clearly with little sleep. So the best negotiators possess the stamina to work around the clock under intense pressure. The whole term shuttle diplomacy was coined by the press, given the round-the-clock negotiations for 2 weeks that Henry Kissinger conducted between Syria, Israel, and Egypt, with almost no sleep. Carter got an average of 3 hours sleep for 13 days at Camp David, and I averaged 4 during the week I was negotiating the climate change negotiations in Kyoto. Successful negotiators can't be, no matter how good, lone rangers. They have to be seen as having the full confidence of the President and the White House staff, so that when they make an offer to the other side, it's recognized that this comes from the highest authority. Jim Baker and George Bush were interchangeable on German reunification because they were so close politically. Even the most skilled negotiators, however, face a problem which is very unique to the United States, and that is we are often unreliable. That is to say that our agreements depend on whoever wins the next election. An example of that is the following. When Reagan beat Carter decisively in 1980, and I certainly shed tears over that, he came into office having criticized the nuclear agreement we reached with the Soviet Union, and yet recognizing it was a representation, even though the Senate hadn't confirmed it, by the previous president, he kept that agreement, SALT, and built on it for 7 years. Contrast that with President Trump, who came in and unilaterally withdrew from the 2015 nuclear agreement, and that's allowed Iran now to break through the constraints of that agreement and get closer than ever before to a nuclear threshold. So another example is what happens with climate change. We're either in or out of climate change depending on who wins the next election. How can you negotiate successfully with other countries if they know that what you've negotiated won't stand until the next election occurs? It's a really terrible problem. Next is the ability to skillfully employ leverage. I think we all know from all the negotiations we do, whether it's with our children, our spouses, our businesses, leverage is crucial. The United States as a superpower has positive and negative leverage. The positive leverage are things like access to our market for foreign goods, but also a good example occurred very recently. When the Abraham Accords were agreed to by the United Arab Emirates and Israel, they were greased by an agreement to provide F-35 fighter jets, which UAE desperately wanted, as a positive incentive to get over the hurdle. The negative incentives are economic sanctions. And economic sanctions are used by the United States more than all the other countries combined. They were very successful in ending apartheid in South Africa. They were successful in getting Iran to the negotiating table in 2015, but they're of decreasing value now. Despite being very comprehensive, they haven't driven the Russians out of Ukraine. They haven't stopped Iran and North Korea from developing their nuclear arms. They haven't gotten President Maduro in Venezuela out of office. We don't have monopolies anymore. And so while they're useful, they are still of limited value. The ultimate sanction is military action. And let me now sort of conclude this part by talking about the rules of military action. No president has a greater burden than to commit U.S. forces to war, with the attendant loss of life and the high costs involved, and because war always has unintended consequences. Example, in the Kosovo conflict in the Balkans with Milosevic and the Serbs committing terrible atrocities, the one thing that was really unintended in 77 days of bombing was we ended up, by mistake, bombing the Chinese embassy. To this day, they believe we did it purposely. It was a mistake, as was the Israeli bombing of the humanitarian food cargo in Gaza. So wars will always have unintended consequences. As heavyweight boxing champion Mike Tyson once put it, everyone has a great plan until they get into the ring and get punched in the face. Military force, again, can be effective in supplementing a diplomatic solution. They shouldn't be seen as polar opposites. They really reinforce each other if done properly. Good example is George H.W. Bush using military force in Iraq. More on that in a minute. But our track record in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in Libya indicates that direct military action often fails to deliver the goals that we seek, and in some cases makes them worse. So here are my rules for when military force should be used. First, there has to be a clear national interest and a well-conceived attainable goal. One of the reasons that George H.W. Bush was successful in using military force in Iraq is he had a very limited political goal, and that is just get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. Indeed, he was sharply criticized when he had Saddam on the run for not choking him, going into Baghdad. And he and Colin Powell said, if we go into Baghdad, we'll own it. We don't want to own Baghdad, something that his son failed to recognize more than a decade later. Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, said, we thought we could use military force in the Second Iraq War to achieve political objectives that were unattainable. A second lesson is the crucial importance of not going it alone, but getting maximum multilateral support. Again, the two Bushes are textbook examples of the opposites. George H.W. Bush got UN Security Council resolutions supporting the use of force to get Saddam out of Kuwait. He had a 38-country coalition. George W. Bush got no Security Council resolution and had a very thin coalition. Third, and closely related, is that if you're going to use military force, it has to be what Colin Powell called decisive. That occurred with 500,000 U.S. troops in the Gulf War under George H.W. Bush. Contrast that with the Iraq War, where we fought 2 wars at the same time, Iraq and Afghanistan. We divided our forces. We had what Don Rumsfeld, who was Bush's Secretary of Defense, called a light footprint. Well, that light footprint was disastrous in both wars, leading Afghanistan to be our longest war ever. Fourth, and this is something really critical that I want to come back to in talking about Gaza, before any military intervention, there has to be a clear agreement with the U.S. military leadership of the goals to be realistically achieved and an understanding of the internal political dynamics and history of the country. We failed to appreciate in the Iraq War that we were deposing a minority Sunni leader, Saddam Hussein, in a majority Shiite country. We often go into our military ventures without thinking through what happens the day after. What happens when you do get Saddam out? What comes next? Have we planned for that properly? Do we know the country well enough so that we can plan it? And even after force is committed and may be successful, we have to have civilian help for reconstruction projects, humanitarian assistance, creating governing structures, or the bravery and sacrifice of our military will be wasted. We often get it backward. We shoot before we plan. General Petraeus said, in one of the 130 interviews I did, that we have to have a nuanced understanding of the countries that we're dealing with, and we have to know what we're going to do afterward. In what was really a very self-revealing interview, Steve Hadley, who was President George W. Bush's national security advisor, said, we got it backward. We should have asked, where do you want to end up? Then you work backward to develop your military plan around that. If you can't leave behind a stable situation, then you shouldn't go to war to begin with. Finally, and most critically, again, I'll get to this in the Gaza discussion, is good intelligence. This was woefully lacking in the Iraq War, where we went to war because of an imaginary weapons of mass destruction. But what I learned in doing this book was something different than I think everybody else understood. What I learned from a number of interviews was that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, in particular chemical weapons, but that he had actually destroyed those weapons in accordance with UN resolutions. And that was not understood by not just the CIA, but by MI6, the British intelligence, by the French intelligence, the German intelligence. They didn't understand that he actually had destroyed them. Well, why didn't he say so publicly then? And the reason is very unusual. He was afraid if he publicly admitted that he did what the UN wanted him to do, that he would weaken himself domestically against his domestic opponents and encourage Iran, his arch enemy, to invade him. So as a result, he lost his life. We lost over 3,000 soldiers because he wouldn't admit, and we didn't know, that he had destroyed his weapons of mass destruction. This is a terrible mistake, and again, one of the things we'll talk about. Now, I want to say that I was party to what was the worst intelligence failure, and I'm here to admit it, in modern American history, if not in all time. And this involves the whole Iranian Revolution in 1979. So here, 6 presidents have supported the Shah of Iran. He had an open shopping list for any arms he wanted. He was our guy in the Middle East. 6 weeks before he was forcibly deposed, 6 weeks, the CIA reported to us that Iran was in neither a revolutionary nor pre-revolutionary state. They did not realize that our principal ally had incurable cancer. Can you imagine? I mean, we would have made very different decisions if we had known that he was not able to think clearly. Absolutely terrible intelligence, and when you have bad intelligence, bad decisions get made. Now, let's apply this to Ukraine and Gaza. First of all, with respect to Ukraine, Henry Kissinger said, you can't earn in the negotiating table what you fail to win on the battlefield. And that's why it's so terribly important to make sure that Ukraine has the most modern weapons possible so that it can get back as much of its territory as possible. And why the 6-month delay in Congress providing that and the slow delivery of Abrams tanks and F-16s has been so debilitating. I think, and this is a guess, but I think that this is not going to end with a true treaty of peace. It's going to end like the 1953 Korean War, with an armistice agreement when both sides decide that they can't achieve anything more on the battlefield in terms of their political gains. Neither is there yet, but they will be there, in my estimation, in 6 months and certainly in a year. In Korea, we've had 70 years of peace between North and South Korea without a peace treaty. We created an armistice and a demilitarized zone, and that will have to happen here. But again, we need to arm the Ukrainians to get back as much as possible. In order to have a credible peace in Ukraine, we have to have a recognition that Ukraine is not going to be able to keep, unfortunately, all of the land that is theirs. That Putin is going to be able to keep, with superior forces, at least some percentage of what he's taken by force. So there are several lessons that we have to learn. The first is not to repeat the mistake we made in Vietnam and in Afghanistan of negotiating behind the back of the governments we were there to fight. When Henry Kissinger negotiated the end of the Vietnam War, the South Vietnamese government was not in the room. When Secretary Pompeo, with the support of President Trump, negotiated the end of the war with the Taliban, completed in the Biden administration, but it was negotiated then, the government for which we fought for 20 years, was not a party to the negotiations. We have to make sure that we don't do this to Zelensky. It's his war, it's his country, and we can't try to negotiate behind his back. In addition, we have to make sure that we do not recognize, with this armistice that I'm suggesting we have, we don't recognize the acquisition by Putin of Ukrainian territory, and that we don't let up on the sanctions against Russia. And then last, and this is going to be really tough, there's an old saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, we've been fooled twice by Putin. 1994, in the Budapest Memorandum, he got the Ukrainians to give up what was the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for a written commitment not to invade any more of Ukraine. Violated in 2014 when he took over Crimea. Then he sent the so-called little green men in without Russian actual uniforms, but Russians, to fight in the Donbass area where the fighting is going on right now. That war ended temporarily with a ceasefire, what were called the Minsk agreements, Minsk 1 and 2. We, the United States of America, signed the Minsk agreements, which assured, that was the term used, assured Ukraine there would be no further aggression by Russia. Russia signed it, the UK signed it, the United States signed it, and then on February 21st, 2022, just 3 days before he invaded, Putin said publicly, the Minsk agreement no longer exists. That's the term he used. And we did nothing, not a damn thing. So in order for Zelensky, at the end of this conflict, when again both sides are exhausted enough to agree to an armistice or maybe a peace, he's got to have assurance that Putin's not going to just rest, reload, and start all over again. Now, they're not going to be members of NATO. We're not going to be able to give them an Article 5 agreement, but perhaps we can give them the kind of long-term security agreement President Biden negotiated this week. If they're members of the European Union, that will make it more difficult for Putin to reinvade, and ultimately some kind of a security guarantee, maybe even having NATO trainers there. Now let's conclude with Gaza, and then obviously I'll take your questions. But I'll do this very briefly, and we can go into it in more detail. There are three elements to a successful war. The first is good intelligence, and here Israel's famed Mossad did not have good intelligence in the following ways. They didn't realize, and Dennis Ross and I chair a think tank in Israel called the Jewish People's Policy Institute, we've had generals brief us and say to us, just within the last few weeks, under our watch, we saw, without realizing it, Hamas convert itself from a terrorist group into a full-blown terrorist army. 30,000 well-trained, well-armed troops in 300 miles of tunnels. We knew they had tunnels, but not 300 miles, and we didn't know some were as deep as 80 meters. How could they not have known that? They didn't. They actually had the October 7th plan in their hands with the gliders and all, and as it made its way up to the ranks of the Mossad, they all said, this terrorist group can't pull this off. This is ridiculous. So the intelligence was really, really terrible, and they thought they could domesticate Hamas by having 18,000 workers come in daily from Gaza. And it turns out that some of those workers were Hamas people who told Hamas where all the critical facilities were. So good intelligence. Second is decisive force. Is the force that Israel is using decisive enough, and can it do what I think has to be done to disable Hamas from being a governing and military force? You cannot have, as a sovereign country, another government at your side that's committed to your destruction. They didn't agree to this war because they wanted a two-state solution. They want the total elimination. But the question of whether they have sufficient force to do it is still an open question. And third is combining diplomacy with war. Hamas can't be defeated by military means alone. One of the lessons of the Iraq War in my book, as I said, is shoot only after you have a plan. The reason Benny Gantz left the War Cabinet this week was because there's still no post-war plan. General Petraeus said that the way he turned around the war in Iraq was with three words: clear, that is, clear an area of terrorists; hold, make sure the area can be held against terrorists, and you saw what happened at the Al-Shifa hospital, where after defeating Hamas they came back again. And third, and most critically, he said, was build, namely, show the non-combatants that you're willing to build a better life from them and separate them from the terrorists. And this is where Israel has got to do more to show its empathy for, its support for average Gazans. Now, yes, a lot of them were cheering when the prisoners were taken, but there's an article today on the front page of the Times. Hamas is not popular among the population. And Israel's got to do more in terms of humanitarian corridors, in terms of holding out a vision for a post-war Gaza. I believe fervently that Israel's real security will come from a diplomatic negotiation, and not with Hamas, but in the following way: forming a coalition which is there for the taking with Egypt, with Jordan, with Bahrain, with the UAE, with whom they already have peace agreements, with Morocco, and ultimately with the Saudis against the Iranian-led axis of resistance, which includes the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah and Syria. The condition of that, however, is some ultimate perspective on the Palestinians. And this the Israeli government currently is not able to give. But that, to me, is the real solution diplomatically, so that the military sacrifices that Israel is making, and they are great, will not be lost because of the absence of a diplomatic process. So I'll conclude my talk and then take your questions by saying that the art of diplomacy is really critical to create the kind of world we want, but it requires nourishing at home our democratic institutions, reducing our internal political polarization, enhancing our economic and military strength. This can combat the disastrous isolationist sentiment gaining traction in our country, and which is going to be on the ballot box in 2024. There's no higher purpose for the U.S. than to leverage our strength and influence through diplomacy to reduce conflict, to address contentious issues, as we've shown we can do before, and to create a better world. If we don't, we're going to leave a more lawless world for our opponents to fill. Thank you very much. So let me take your questions. Thank you. Yes. May I make just one joke about questions? So I don't know, Carolyn, if you worked with Russell Long when he was still in the Senate. Russell Long was a senator from Louisiana, and his father was the legendary Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana, a very colorful, populist guy. And Russell said that when he was a young boy growing up in the governor's mansion, and his father was governor, that his father came home one night just stone cold drunk and staggered up the stairs of the governor's mansion with a very shaky hand, got the key in the keyhole to a line, opened the door of the governor's mansion, and then Russell, holding on to Mama's apron strings, his mother and the governor's wife, saw Papa collapse in the foyer. And he said, Mama looked down with her hands crossed, waiting for an explanation as to how this state of affairs could have happened to the governor of the great state of Louisiana. And Russell said, Papa said, without pausing, Mama, I've completed my prepared remarks. I'll now take questions from the floor. So I assure you I've only been given water, but I'll be glad to take questions from the floor.
Hi there. I come from India. When I was growing up in India, thinking about US, it was thought of, when I look back in my younger years, as an autocratic society, which were telling everybody, dictating what has to be done. All right? Even though, as I've grown up, became a US citizen, built up a business here, I realized there's a lot of help being given to people, both in India and we're trying to help globally. Right? The ideological mindset, correct? How do you bring the ideology on your side? Because if you look at any of the wars, part of the thing which I'm perplexed by, because between India and Pakistan we fought a war, correct? A lot of time. Whether it's Palestinian, whether it's Ukraine, how do you get the ideologically, like, because you can't defeat, you can defeat an army, but you can't defeat an ideology.
Well, first of all, I mean, the Pakistan-India war is an example where, in effect, an area was carved out, Bangladesh, to try to resolve it. And while there are occasional skirmishes, there basically has been no war between the two. Now, here let's go to the Israel side. Israelis sort of use a pejorative term when they talk about this called hasbara, like it's just pure propaganda. Who cares about hasbara? But this is critically important to get the message out. And one of the reasons that I spent time in my remarks talking about the number of opportunities when Palestinians were given a state on a platter and rejected it is because people just don't understand that. And that message has got to be given, number one. Number two, we've got to do a better job, the Israelis and those of us who support Israel, of making it clear that there will be a better day for the Gazans if they remove themselves from Hamas. I mean, it's very clear that Sinwar doesn't give a damn how many Gazans are killed. He thinks time is on his side. He sees 3 European Union countries that unilaterally recognize the Palestinian state. He sees demonstrations on our college campuses. I saw them at Columbia. Again, I went to Columbia the afternoon of the second Seder up here. The president, and it's not just, by the way, the students. I talked to the father of the president of Emory, who's a Holocaust survivor. And the son negotiated for days to try to get these demonstrators to remove their tents and so forth at Emory, and finally called in the Atlanta police, which did not use major force. They were very careful. And yet 2/3 of the faculty senate at Emory in Atlanta voted to censure the president, and the same thing happened at Dartmouth. And 170 professors at Columbia went on strike for the last 2 weeks of class in support of the students. And one of the things, by the way, that struck me when I went to Columbia, and I only got in because there was a professor who got us in, otherwise it was an armed camp, is that there were maybe 200 identical tents, all green REI tents. Somebody paid for those. So the messaging is also critically important in sustaining support, and Israel has not done anything like, in fact, quite the contrary. Some of the more radical members of his government have been so provocative that they've really turned people off. Yes, sir.
I just want to address the Ukraine situation a little bit.
Do we have an extra mic? Do we have an extra mic? No?
Stand up.
Stand up.
I'll repeat the question.
James Baker and Edward Shevardnadze made a deal for Germany, for West Germany.
Right.
Sorry, East Germany.
Yes.
And the commitment was that there would be no expansion beyond.
Okay, this is a really good question.
So what happened, and why are we in Ukraine?
Okay. So the question is, did the agreement, and I quizzed Baker and his aides on this very question. When he got what was still the Soviet Union to agree to a united Germany within NATO, did Baker make a commitment that NATO would not be expanded any further to the east toward Russia? Now, first, one humorous point, and that is Baker and Bush not only had to convince the Soviets to accept a united Germany, he had to convince our other wartime allies who were occupying West Germany at the time, the French and the British. Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, and she made the famous statement, "I love Germany so much I want 2 of them." She was afraid of the power of a united Germany, so it was a big haul. Now, Baker does admit, and he did say publicly, that NATO would not go 1 inch further east. But he quickly withdrew that, and in the actual agreement that was negotiated, there is not one reference to expansion of NATO to the east. Now, there's still the question, did that expansion to Bulgaria, to Hungary, to Romania, is that what provoked Putin to go into Ukraine? I think the answer is no, because he had already gone into Georgia, not my Georgia in Atlanta, but the country of Georgia, and he does not believe Ukraine is a real entity. He sees it as part of the former Soviet Union. So I don't think that that expansion did it. However, I interviewed a number of secretaries of defense, and 3 of them, Perry, Panetta, and Bill Cohen, all said that we did not do enough after the collapse of the Soviet Union to bring them into the NATO Council, to give them economic assistance, to have a Marshall Plan, because their economy totally, I mean, it shrunk like 70%. They were in a disastrous situation. And we did not give them the kind of help that could have made a difference. One thing we often forget, and God knows I'm no supporter of Putin, but after 9/11, Putin said, quote unquote, "We are all Americans." And he offered a military base in Kazakhstan for us to go after the Taliban, which Rumsfeld rejected. So there's
I did business there, and the messages that I got was that they would have liked to be more part of the West.
yes, so he's saying that business wanted to be more part of the West, and instead what we did is we said privatize immediately. All the oligarchs just took the property up at bargain basement payments. We did not give them the kind of economic aid. We didn't give them the kind of business cooperation. We didn't create Western American Russian business councils. We really did not do what we could have, and I think we would have had a very different Russia today. Yes?
History has shown that all these wars and conflicts, many of them have been resolved peacefully, and they stayed that way. They just stayed that way. It's not for a certain number of years. But as you mentioned, in at least two cases, with Putin and with Hamas, that history has shown that you can't deal with it. And when you talk about a peace treaty, if everything takes place, just like you mentioned with Putin, whatever he put in writing didn't do a damn thing. So my question is, how is it that we don't learn, at least from those two examples?
Yeah. So the question is that I cite a number of examples, both in my talk and in a speech, where military force was useful. Bosnia, Kosovo, the first Iraq War, and others where it was a disaster, like Libya. I mean, Obama said that the worst mistake of his presidency was getting involved in Libya and deposing Gaddafi. As bad as he was, we have nothing but civil war since. So what do you do, the question is, with Ukraine and with Gaza? So I've already suggested that with Ukraine, what we need to do is have, and there will be, an ultimate agreement of some kind, but we don't recognize their acquisition of territory, we keep sanctions on, and we provide some genuine security guarantees so that Putin can't just go back and attack again. And that is going to be very controversial. I mean, when you see the isolationist mood in this country, will we agree to back that up? Now, Biden just this week, agreed at the G7 summit to a 10-year military agreement with Ukraine. If Trump is elected, will he keep it? Probably not. And what signal will that send to Putin? With respect to Gaza, Hamas is not a negotiating partner. We cannot negotiate with them. They have to be weakened sufficiently so that we can get a multinational force in, so that we can get humanitarian aid, so that we can marginalize them. And that's going to take further military action, but it will also take what's been missing, which is a greater sympathy for, recognition of, help for the non-combatants. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned earlier that in order to have a peace, you need the two parties to negotiate. This actually just is tantamount to your question. Recent statistics over the last 2 days show that about 75% of the Gazan civilians, not terrorists, approve of Hamas and approve of the war. So with whom are you going
Well,
to
okay,
negotiate?
actually those figures are not really accurate. I mean, there are many more polls showing that a majority of the civilians now reject Hamas, but the way to try to nurture, whatever the percentage is, to to nurture them away from Hamas is to give them some concrete economic benefits, to realize that Hamas is using them as human shields, that Hamas has not produced anything tangible economically, and to be able to produce jobs, infrastructure, health care, and so forth that Hamas doesn't do.
Isn't that, in fact, what Israel was doing by allowing so many thousands to come across the border and work every day? They came across freely.
That's what it was trying to do.
They were trying to do that.
But it did it at the expense of weakening the Palestinian Authority, holding back taxes from them, and not having a more moderate government take over. And you know, the Palestinian Authority, for all of its corruption and all of its weakness, is at least a better negotiating partner than Hamas. But you're right, there was an effort at doing it, but you know, we now, that's why I said the intelligence is so bad. We now realize Hamas can't be a negotiating partner.
So who is going to be the negotiator?
It has to, you have to find indigenous Gazans who want to break from Hamas and who have a stake in a more prosperous Gaza. And you have to get the West Bank Palestinians involved. They were thrown out in the Civil War in 2006. Yes. Yes, please.
I have a question in regards to the effectiveness of sanctions. We saw with Ukraine, we saw the Wagner Group and all of these private military companies we can't directly negotiate with. And we saw these same people in all over Africa, Somalia, Burkina Faso in the last couple of years overthrowing governments. The Wall Street Journal ran an article saying that some of Hamas was trained by the Wagner Group. So how do we sanction?
Okay. So, I mean, I was in charge of sanctions for the Clinton administration. I negotiated with the European Union and with many other countries on sanctions. We don't have today the kind of monopoly on products that we did 25 years ago. We have to get allies involved as well. But I have to say I was mistaken in thinking that at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the sanctions which were imposed on Russia were more comprehensive than almost any used. Banking sanctions, the European Union, including Germany, agreed not to take any oil. I mean, they were 40% dependent for their oil, and now they're 5% dependent. And I really thought that this would have an impact. It did temporarily with the ruble going down, but now this shows the weakness of sanctions. They've been able to use fake companies, middlemen, transshipment of products, even through Morocco, where they take prohibited goods which are not prohibited to Morocco, but then they get transferred onto ships that end up going into Russia. And critically, the help of China. China has really, been a purchaser of their oil, a supplier of a lot of products, and so there's actual growth, not a lot, but it's actual growth in Russia. On the other hand, Russia has lost 300,000 soldiers, 100,000 dead and 200,000 wounded. They've lost half of their Black Sea fleet. So there will come a time in which they will realize they can't accomplish anything more. And I hope that this latest batch of aid and additional missiles will at least give Ukraine a stronger negotiating posture. But sanctions alone clearly don't cut it.